Hello again. For some reason, section 1.5 is a challenging section for students, and the majority of it is because it takes time to memorize the vocabulary. So it's not that any of these are difficult, but I guess it's a combination of naming angles and how we name them in 3 letters, usually, and just memorizing the difference between these angle types. So I thought instead of starting from the beginning, let's start with the ones that you already know. So by now, you should already know what complementary angles are and supplementary angles are. And so if you can't quite remember the difference between them, they go in alphabetical order from smallest to largest. So complementary angles are going to add up to 90 degrees. Two angles whose sum is 90 degrees. Smaller or earlier in the alphabet, smaller number. Now later in the alphabet, we have supplementary angles, and that is two angles whose sum is 180 degrees. Now it is very important that you understand it takes two angles to be complementary and two angles to be supplementary. So you can't be complementary. You can give compliments to, just think it takes two people to be complimentary. So if you want to give someone a compliment, there has to be someone else there with you. You can't do it all by yourself. So it takes two angles together, to work together, to be complementary or supplementary. So let's see, in junior high, you probably saw them separately. Like this, and maybe this one was 10 degrees and this was 80 degrees, and you'd say those are complementary because 10 plus 80 gives you 90. This year you'll see it more often like this, where you have a right angle marked, and we know already that a right angle measures 90 degrees, and then you've got a ray that cuts that 90-degree angle into two different angles. Now, they don't have to be congruent. They can be two, and I purposely drew that so it wasn't down the middle. So let's say this is angle 1 and this is angle 2. We would say angle 1 is complementary to angle 2. And you can use the abbreviation there. That's fine with me. Now, supplementary is similar in that it's possible that in junior high, you were given, say, a 100-degree angle, and then you had an 80-degree angle, and you knew just because they totaled up to 180 that they were supplementary. This year, it will be more like we have a straight line, which we know measures 180, and there will be a ray that's breaking that straight angle into two separate angles. So let's call those 3 and 4. So we could say angle 3 is supplementary to angle 4. So this is the old way. It's not that you can't see it that way anymore, but really it's going to be more, oops, that should say 2 right there. It will be more like this, forming a right angle together or forming a straight line together. Okay, so this right angle all by itself can't be complementary. There's got to be two of them. Okay, these are angle pairs. All of these are angle pairs, perpendicular segment pairs, but these are all angle pairs. So you need to make sure you name 2. I'm guessing that you are familiar with perpendicular as well. So let's do that one to get out of the way the ones that we know. So these are all angle pairs. These are lines. So let's go ahead and write that in there, perpendicular lines. And hopefully you know that perpendicular lines are lines that come together at right angles. So usually in a picture they would only show one right angle, because if that one is a right angle, so will all 3 of these be right angles. And let's suppose this had a little A floating on the outside and this had a B. Then we would say line, write this down in the corner, line A is perpendicular. That's the symbol for it. It's an uppercase T, or I'm sorry, an upside down T. And it is perpendicular to line B. So the symbol let's put the symbol here first. Okay, and it's two lines or segments that intersect to form right angles. It can also be rays that intersect. So you could have this ray and this ray intersecting to form a right angle, and those two rays would be perpendicular. So you would just say ray AB is perpendicular to ray AC. Okay, so it can also be rays. So I'm assuming these three you're already familiar with, and hopefully if you're having trouble with those, you can get that straightened out by using the alphabetical order idea. So that leaves these three as the newer ones that you really need to concentrate on. Linear pair is really, for some reason, one of the most challenging ones. And so we'll put a star next to that one. But let's talk about adjacent first. Adjacent may or may not be a word that you have heard in the English language before in other situations. But adjacent, when you live adjacent to someone, you live next to them. They're like your neighbor. Or if you sit adjacent to Mary, you sit next to Mary. So adjacent means next to. And if you consider two angles that are next to each other, let's use this diagram. We'll use the same one. Okay. That would be angle XYA and angle AYZ. Or you could say angle 1 and angle 2. Well, what happens if they're next to each other? If you live in these triangular yards and you live next to this person over here, or this yard, then you're going to share a fence between your yard. And that is exactly what we talk about in the definition of adjacent angles. Now this fence is what shape or what figure? It's a ray. So adjacent angles are two angles that share a common vertex and a side. So we'll back up here to sides of an angle. That's a ray. A ray would be a side of an angle. Okay, so you have to share the same vertex, of course, and an entire ray or an entire fence post between them. So those are adjacent. Adjacent means next to. Vertical is kind of the opposite of that. Vertical angles are instead not neighbors, but across from each other. So let's put some angle numbers in here. So can you look at that picture and see which ones would be vertical? Okay. So angle 1 and angle 3 are vertical angles. And angle 2 and angle 4 are vertical angles. So they are across from each other, all the way across the intersection if that was two roads intersecting. So I'm going to write across from. Okay, that's the informal definition, but the formal definition is two non-adjacent angles. Now this is one of our verbs, adjacent, or I'm sorry, one of our terms. So non-adjacent means they're not next to each other. So two non-adjacent angles formed by intersecting lines or segments or rays. Okay. So more important, I mean, it's easy to remember. Adjacent means next to, vertical means across from. So that's probably the one you'll probably fall back on. The other thing we know about vertical angles is that they're always congruent. So that means angle 1, if it is 80 degrees, then angle 3 has to be 80 degrees. And if angle 2 is 100 degrees, then angle 4 has to be 100 degrees. So they are also going to be congruent. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. Okay. And the last one in the section is the most challenging one, I think, because it doesn't have the word angles. They see a linear pair and don't see angles plural, and I get a lot of students that name one thing. We are still looking for a pair of angles. A pair of angles. So it's still like these others where you're naming two together. So when you see pair, and in the word linear you see line. So it's really just a pair of angles that form a line. All right? And so, for example, if we have this straight angle and this ray that's cutting this angle, and we've got D, E, C, that's an E, and B, then angle BED and angle BEC are a linear pair, a pair of angles that form a line. All right, and you'll see the similarities between linear pair and supplementary. Okay, if they are supplementary, they could be a linear pair like this, or they could be separate from each other. But any linear pair is always going to be supplementary, because if they form a line, then they automatically form 180 degrees. The formal definition, let's put this: two adjacent angles that form a line. Okay, that's the formal definition, but this is kind of what you get when you translate the terminology here. So that's what we're looking at for 1.5, and all of those angle pairs. So just be careful that you understand that all of these are angle pairs, and then of course perpendicular, those are lines. You may have to go back and listen to this multiple times, and that's fine, whatever you have to do to learn all of this vocab.